The river that cleaved Volantis in two wore the sky as a dark mirror. Lanterns swam on it like the eyes of fish. Halkan the fisher had a habit of talking to the water when it was black and sure of itself. He set his net with the quiet that came from years and a back bent by salt and sun, and he told the Roin, "Tomorrow's catch will be better." He said it every night. The river never answered him, and that was a comfort. On the opposite bank, the Red Temple burned with its own dawn, even though it was deep night. Priests in scarlet were flecks of ember on the steps, ceaseless, their voices caught in the throat of Volantis, rising and falling. Halkan frowned at them and spat into the river. He had no use for gods that spoke through men, and less for men who spoke for gods. The wind shifted, not a sea wind, but a furnace wind, a breath from an oven someone had opened in the dark. Halkan lifted his head like a dog scenting. The lantern on the prow guttered and snuffed. He had a moment to be annoyed about that. He had no moments after. Shadow unstitched the stars. It came like a lid placed upon the night. The river went bright beneath it, spangles of fire racing over the skin of the water as if something above set it alight. Hawken's voice, which did not cry for anything, made a small sound, a thread pulled from a cloak. It was not the god's comet that men had argued over years before. It was not a cloud. It was not a storm, though the wind fell to its knees. It was wings, and they went on, the way the steppe goes on until the world becomes only grass and sky and you feel you could walk forever and never arrive. The body that owned those wings was obsidian made flesh, mountain black, river black, swallowing light and giving it back as the red breath that ran along his belly and throat. When he exhaled, the night turned to day where his fire fell. Slaver galleys lay at anchor at the mouth of the river, heavy with iron and lies. Their decks shouted a protest that no one would remember. Drogon, he had been named once by a girl in a red waist, came down on them as a storm might come down on a stand of brittle trees. He did not scream. The sound that tore from him had nothing of plea or fury in it. It was a declaration. I am. Hawken's skiff rolled and ran from the heat. He cowered behind the rim of it, his cheek pressed to the tarred wood, and felt his teeth judder as the great body passed not far above him, the air behind the passing like the backwash of 1,000 oars. The river swelled from heat. The galleys split and went to pieces that rose like sparks, each piece catching, becoming its own small star, then winking. One man on one deck threw a harpoon without aim. It did not reach. Men leapt into the river because men always leap where fire is, as if water were a bargain that would be honored. The Red Temple howled its satisfaction in the name of its god. Halkan watched the god's servants kneel to the shape in the sky, and the shape did not kneel back. It turned once over the city, tilting its wing so that a whole quarter of Volantis saw itself under the black sail and screamed as one body. Then it stooped on the furthest galley and pressed it into the river as a boy presses a beetle into the ground. The river took the men who had thought to own other men, and Hawken's net drifted free, forgotten. By dawn, the river had grown quiet again, furtive, as if a thief had passed and the house pretended to sleep. Char drifted downstream. Planks that had been men's road, a length of rope that had been a leash, a iron ring that had been a promise. Halkan hauled his net and found it empty. He did not speak to the river. He did not speak at all until he stumbled into a morning market and said to the woman who poured his beer, he was bigger than the stories. Then he sat with his beer going warm and thought of the way wings can be a roof and a doom both. They called him 100 names that week in 100 tongues. The red priests called him that which had been foretold under other titles. Sailors who'd sailed up the Roin from Qohor called him Old Doom Returned. The Triarchs, behind their green and black and red veils, called him a problem. Dooms are old stories until they are not. And men, who have always believed they might live in the shade of other men's shadows if only they stand very still, began to step more carefully. Maester Dennis Vanes of Old Town stepped carefully by habit, which made it easy to step more carefully now. He stood on the aft deck of a Lysini carrack, clutching the rail with white fingers because the captain loved a following sea and too much sail. Dennis's hands were pale even by the standards of Old Town. His chain was new enough that its links still gleamed, and heavy enough that his neck felt sometimes as if a stranger had thrown an arm about him from behind and insisted on an intimacy Dennis did not desire. "Aboard my ship," the captain announced to no one and everyone. "We drink to being late when death is early." He laughed and spat in the same breath. He had yellow braid wound into his beard and rings on every finger, even his thumbs. "But we are just in time, Maester. The Black One tasted Volantis last night, if the flocks of birds we passed were any measure. And the smoke on the horizon. You will have your sight. I will have my sight," Dennis agreed, and tried not to sound as if he were swallowing a prayer with his words. "And I will have a measure." He had packed the wrong weight of tools. Knowledge made poor luggage. He had graduated to his chain with a thesis on the measurements and mishaps of giants, architectural, political, animal. "What is the measure of dominance?" the Archmaester had asked him as 7 old men leaned toward him in the soft light of the scribe's hearth. "When was Balerion larger than a keep and smaller than a hill? Who knows? They wrote poems, boy. They sang." The Archmaester had smiled, which struck Dennis then as kindness, and later as cruelty. "Bring me a number." They made the coast before noon, the captain finding shoal water as if it had been his nurse. To starboard the sky was clotted with brown, the breath of Volantis. To port the open sea lay gentle as watered silk. Straight ahead the world wore its old wound. Valeria's ruin was a bruise you could see 10 leagues away on a day of clear sight, and Dennis's sight was clear. Pillars of vapor, quartered with ash shoulders where rock pressed up against the sea, rose and folded on themselves like dancers growing tired. The horizon itself wavered where heat had bent it. The captain swore, with admiration and dismay braided together. "Smoke enough for 10 cities, he said. "We won't go nearer than a respectful curse. You have your eyes, Maester. Don't go asking the gods for hands as well." Dennis raised his glass, which was ground crystal and precious and useless in a wind. He held it by its foot and squinted through it, not because the crystal would tell him anything, but because it placed a small circle between him and the world seemed likely to swallow anyone who looked at it with a naked face. On the line of smoke, a shape moved. It made the smoke appear to move around it, as if the ruin itself had decided to go for a walk. He had seen skulls. Everyone who learned in Old Town saw skulls. He had stood beneath the jaw of a dragon dead centuries and listened to the rain in the skull's hollow and had imagined, as everyone does, the rain falling on a brain big as a house. He had read measurements, none agreeing with one another, figures written in crabbed hands by men whose fear or awe had set their numbers wandering. He had calculated the upward limit by a reckoning of bone density and wing load that he did not trust because it had been proved 100 times in birds and never once in dragons. He had built, in his mind, a shape that would make a mockery of all his calculations and then done what good students do. Declared it extreme and rare and neatly contained in a sentence. Now he watched that sentence uncontain itself. Sailors are superstitious when they are bored and rational when they are afraid. The men on deck had the look of men scraping for rationality with dull knives. No one spoke, not even the captain with all his rings. The big shape took the sky as easily as a fish takes its stream. It was not that it flew farther than birds flew. That could be imagined. It was that in flight it changed the nature of the sky. It set the mold, and the sky poured itself around. Its wings did not beat many times, and when they beat, Dennis saw the masts bow as if they had taken a knuckle in the wind. 7, a sailor whispered. An untidy prayer to a pantheon that had always been generous with mother's milk and less certain with fire. Someone else said a harder name in a harsher tongue and was hushed. Dennis did not pray. He realized dismally that he had forgotten how. He had polished awe into footnotes for so long that the polished thing refused to show him what he had known as a boy, that some sights rose up not to be explained but to be endured. Balerion, breathed the captain. An old name, given to a new living fact. Dennis, dutiful, corrected him, as if corrections could keep the keel where it belonged and the sky in its place. "No," he said. "Drogon." The dragon did not stoop. It did not look at the carrack. If it had, No one there would have ever been able to forget themselves into sleep. It moved along the line of smoke toward a jag of stone that thrust up from the sea like a fawn. As it passed, light changed on the water from blue to green to the color of coins at the bottom of a deep well. Dennis's measurements, drawn up on paper in neat columns, buckled in his mind like parchment caught in a hearth spark. "Bring me a number," the Archmaester had said, and here was a number in a language Dennis did not speak. He spoke aloud because to put words in air sometimes made them believe they were true. "His primary wingspan exceeds, we cannot see the tips. Call them twice the mast length." He heard the tremor in his own voice and could not afford to hate himself for it. "No more. And the head, if the skull of Balerion in King's Landing's vaults is a hall, then this living skull is." "We don't carry halls," the captain said hoarsely. "Only people who'd like to live in them." The dragon reached the thong of stone and set himself upon it as a gull sets himself upon a post. The stone took his weight and did not yield, and that, Dennis thought irrelevantly, was the only necessary piece of engineering in this moment. The proof that the world could hold what flew over it. In the cool of a tent that had seen more weddings than wars, Ketsa tightened the leather thong around her hair and told the boy who had been her husband for 20 days that his horse would not die if he slept with his head on its flank. He had asked. Men asked in the Dothraki Sea with the same straight certainty as they killed. They also asked thin questions like this, and Ketsa loved them for that. The horse, patient, looked at Ketsa with a gaze that forgave the world everything. There had been a sign in the night. She had felt it in her teeth. The Maras had lifted their heads and snorted and then gone as still as moons. Her mother had been a Kalaka's sister and had died when Ketsa was 9, leaving her a bag of boiled leather and 2 songs, one for braiding hair and one for braiding fate. She had used both often. Her husband dreamed the way boys dream, of small victories that were big because they happened to him, and when he snored he sounded like a war drum a long way off. Ketsa sat outside the tent and watched the empty grass and knew it was not empty. There are places other people will not see that a woman who has watched her mother die can see. She listened, and the grass whispered not with wind but heat. He had passed. The Black One. She spoke to him because Omion should. "You are a stallion without a rider," she told the air and smiled. "Come and see our herd, then. It is a good herd." She was not afraid to invite a god. Gods, in her experience, were only men you could not look in the eye. She had never seen a dragon with eyes and therefore could not know if it qualified. When morning broke, and the people of her Khalasar began to move like a river loosed from its banks, the old woman with the cracked lips and the bright eyes who told the stories of the dead tugged on Ketsa's sleeve. "Child," she said, and Ketsa did not mind being called child by a woman who had watched the first grass grow in this field and could remember the way the dragons had been a long time ago when men said they were small enough to be taken like a hawk. "Do you know what passed?" "Yes," Ketsa said simply. "Do you know why?" She did not yet. She would. The women of the Dothraki know things as if they were a road they could ride out and back and measure with horse strides. Ketsa's road had just opened, and she swung into the saddle of herself. On Dragonstone the sea blew salt breath through every hall and armory and priest's cell. Lady Mara Valerion rose before the dawn because sleep clung to her like a lover she did not trust and she liked to peel it off. She went to the parapet above the sea and watched the horizon for ships that were late and whales that were timely. Driftmark lay across the water, a slate lid set upon wealth. Her blood was thinned by some reckonings and steel by others, which was to say she had more Valerion in her courtesy and less in her face, and when she smiled it was like the run of a blade across cloth. Dragonstone itself, with its black spires shaped like creatures that remembered the time before men sheathed their fear in speech, had never seemed asleep to Mara. It kept its eyes to itself when no one watched, but she felt them. She was not a woman to admit that feeling, even to herself. She was a woman to study ledgers until numbers grew into a wall she could lean against. She had hung tapestries over the worst of the walls, not because she needed their softness but to prove to the walls that she could do it. A raven came to her hand that morning, as if her thought had called it. It bore a cylinder sealed with black wax and the impression of a trident. She broke the seal with a thumbnail and read the Triarch's measured threat with admiration for their clerk's turn of phrase. It said there was a dragon in their skies and other dragons in men's throats. It said, in so many words, if your island bears the old name, it might bear new trouble. It said, we will pay for your ships. Mara looked out at the water and saw the capital that no scribe could weigh. She had a captain's mind in a lady's body and a sense of tide that had nothing to do with moon. She turned and walked the length of the parapet, her steps soundless on the stone worn by older fears. At the far end a boy waited with a slate and chalk, as she had told him to do 3 months ago, when the first rumor of a dragon's shadow over the Dornish sands had reached her. Right? She said, and the boy's chalk made a polite sound. To the Prince of Driftmark. I will not sell my ships to men who fear the wrong thing. I will lend them to fear properly. Prepare a fast sloop with sober colors and clever crew. We go to sea. She did not need to add where. No one on this island needed to be told how the wind blew now. Back in Old Town, under roof and ivy and a summer haze that made even the tower's sharp points look as if they'd been thumbed down a little, Archmaester Peristan, otherwise called the Picker for his habits at table, set down Dennis's last raven and did a thing he had done seldom in a long life. He laughed aloud. One of the novices in the scriptorium glanced up in surprise and spilled sand on a wet page. Peristan did not notice or care. He read Dennis's neat lines again. Sights measured by old tricks, spans of mast, the length of a longboat, the distance between the mastheads of 2 carracks when the dragon's head passed above and obscured both. Dennis had tried to turn astonishment into comparison, and the ache of that attempt showed in every line. A line at the bottom gave Peristan pause. If the skull in the vaults at King's Landing is as described in the histories, Dennis wrote, and it was the kind of sentence that polymaths loathe, conditional and tethered, then this living creature's head alone could make a door of that skull. Note: if the skull indeed remains in its place, for there are rumors of the capital's fall or partial ruin, or... The note ran out of ink. Peristan laid the page flat and placed a finger on it and did not move for some time. King's Landing. There was little comfort anywhere in a phrase that so obstinately admitted the world changes while men argue whether it should. The city might be fire or stone or mud. It might hold the skull or might hold only a memory of the skull. He dismissed the novice with a jerk of his head and went to the Ravenry himself. The birds muttered in their sleep of day and woke to his presence. He wrote 3 letters quickly, to men who owed him favors and to one man who did not owe anyone anything, and sent them with birds he trusted to fly straight. On the carrack, Dennis slept in fits and snatches, and in the ragged pieces of his sleep a girl he had never met stood on black stone while a black creature with eyes like furnace mouths bent its neck so that she could touch the place where the scales at its jaw were thinnest. He woke gasping and pressed the heel of his hand against his own jaw and laughed, quietly, so others would not hear his fear and think it a contagious disease. He found the captain on deck drinking wine that sweated from the pitcher. "You'll have your story to take back to your cold tower," the captain said, not unkindly. "Men will listen close when you speak it. Men listen for what they want to hear." Dennis said. "I have learned to speak only what I can measure." "You can measure heat," the captain said. "You can measure shadow. Heat has numbers only after it has left the body it burned," Dennis said, and the captain nodded, as a man who had buried friends does without needing the words explained. Elia of Lys had silver hair when she wanted to, which was to say she paid for it with coin and sat in a chair while a woman with bottle and brush made a tide run through her that could not touch her blood. She had purple eyes no matter what, and they drew looks the way coins draw hands. She had been born in a house where the sounds came through the floorboards like a second language. Music on a night when music meant accounts had balanced. Low voices on a night when low voices meant anger had been drunk but not spent. And had found the sea the first time a man whose name she was supposed to remember put her out and said he would send for her and did not. The sea asked nothing of her, and so she gave it everything that could be taken by walking aboard a ship that would sail without her if she did not step lively. She sailed under a dozen names. Elia was the one she kept for herself, the one she used when she sat alone in small rooms. She kept notes as a habit the way some keep knives, and her notes were full of sentences that did not wag for effect. She had been in Karth when news came of the girl in a fire in the waste. She had been in Bravos when the men of the Iron Bank called in their loans with quiet voices. She had been in Volantis when the Red Temple hung garlands of smoke for a day and a night, and men came weeping to give their bracelets of gold to a god who had not asked. She had never been to Valyria. She had not wanted to die in a way that admitted she had gone to sea. She wanted, quite stubbornly, to live and see. She had thought it necessary to choose. On the wharf of Volantis, where men with money and men with knives often talked about the same thing in different words, Elia bought a seat on Mara Valerion's sloop with a ring she had been saving for a slower fall from grace. The quartermaster weighed the ring on his tongue out of old habit, and then, seeing her hair in the sun and the eyes that went with it, weighed other possibilities. She met his gaze, holding it until the cheap temptation in him burned to ash. He nodded and chalked her name in his book. She boarded without looking back, because looking back had never saved anyone. They ran the line of smoke like a lintel, keeping it at a respectful distance because even the cleanest ships come away dirted from a door into hell. The sloop skipped like a stone, showing her belly between waves. Sailors told their stories for the first day in a mad, generous flood, as men sometimes do when they sense something greater than themselves approaching and fear they may lose their tongues before they can use them. On the second day they fell quiet and polished their knives and practiced knots they already knew. On the third day they saw him. No one said his name at first. Names had been cheap for too long, and this thing they saw made names feel like coins you should not spend all in one market. He came with the dawn, riding the line where night and day choose which side of the world to own. He came from the east, as he always had, and Elia thought of broken chains and hissed and threw the thought away because other men had used that phrase to make things she hated beautiful. He came so low that the sloop tipped as if she curtsied. He did not notice. He did not have to notice to change the sea. He lifted onto a curl of black stone and rested. Elia looked along the length of him and could not see his end. She would have laughed if laughter had been an act of worship men had agreed upon. Her throat hurt with surprise, and she pressed her palm against the rail to steady the shake in her hand. She said, because it felt necessary that someone should. He is alone. Mara Valerion stood not 3 paces from her, steady without trying. Nothing that sighs is alone, she said. We are all of us attended. By gods. By the things we have done. Mara never dressed her words to impress. If the stories are true, he had a rider once who brought him into the world and put a name onto him. Dragons remember, so do women. And men, Elia asked, more from habit than need. Men remember their stories, Mara said. If the story does not serve them, they call it a lie. Do you plan to give him a rider? Elia asked. Mara turned and looked at her with the particular concentration of a woman weighing a blade on an old scale. Do you plan to ride him? Yes, Elia said, before she could be polite. She was always surprised at the ease with which she told her truths when they were ridiculous. But I am not a fool. You are one thing or the other, Mara said. On Dragonstone we make that choice when we wake and then again when we sleep. We will go ashore. It had been said by men who were allowed to say such things that Valyria was a ruin beyond ruin, a place where even memory went wrong. Elia had avoided it not because she feared to walk on ground where the world had ended, but because men used it to dress their cowardice with poetry, and she would not give them the satisfaction. Now, stepping down onto a black beach where the stones chattered underfoot like teeth, she felt no poetry in herself. She felt heat and the damp hands of a distant sea on the wind and the stillness of a land that had learned to hold its breath for a long time. The dragon sat a quarter-mile away on a shoulder of cooled rock. He sat like a mountain that had the idea of moving soon. His head lay on his own foreleg with the languor of a great cat, and his eyes were half-hooded because the dawn bothered him. Ash feathered the air. It sifted into Elia's hair and made her silver honest for once. She walked at Mara's shoulder because to walk alone toward such a creature would have been an act born not of bravery but of estrangement. Men came behind them with braided ropes and hooks and a dozen plans that had never touched a dragon, and Dennis Vanes of Old Town came among them with a satchel of carefully useless tools. He had come over to the sloop in a longboat with the unlovely ease of a scholar who had spent too many years sitting and had learned to make a boat do the moving for him. He was talking as he came because talking gave him a ladder out of his own mind when it threatened to flood. Balerion grew slowly after his first century, he said to Mera, who was not listening, and to Elia, who was and was not. The scarring along his left wing shows an old injury repaired, which suggests some limit to size set by... He broke off, because words fall silent in the presence of something that does not need them. The dragon lifted his head. It was not majestic. It was ordinary and therefore terrifying. The way a huge thing moves a little and you realize the ground you are on is a small thing and your nature is a small thing and your heart beats a short time. Elia heard, under the ash, the faint hiss of his breath, which smelled of copper and caves. She stepped forward one pace, as if he had tugged a string tied to her chest. Mera's hand fell heavy on her forearm and then let go, which was a gift. Elia did not know any words of the old tongue that were not profane or lovemaking. She did not think he would be misled by either. She used the plainest language she owned. "You are a fact," she said. "I will not beg you to be a story." He dipped his head again and brought his snout toward her. The sound of ash against scale made a whisper like a dress across a floor. She could have stepped into his mouth without bending, and for a brief, wild instant she understood the old tales of maidens and monsters. The longing to end in something that has no need of you, the relief of surrender. She laughed at herself, because she was not made for surrender. She lifted her palm and rested it against a scale the size of a kettle lid, and it was warm but not hot, and slick with the fine ash that fell constant as rain. Dennis, later, would write that the smell at the scales was not rank, as one might suppose given the distance from the air to the muscle beneath, but clean, as if heat kept rot and damp at bay. He would measure the span of a forklaw against his own arm and write down the measure though the number told him nothing, and he would draw badly a line along the wing where he thought old scar had become new hardness. He would not write about the moment he thought the dragon looked at him and knew him, because Dennis saved his lies for himself and would not spend them in public. Men are cowards and men are brave, and sometimes they are both at once and it makes them human. The sailors with the ropes decided, together without talking, that the ropes would not serve. The hooks looked ridiculous on the beach with ash softening every sharp. They did not put them away. They left them there like excuses discarded. One priest from the Red Temple of Volantis, who had come like a stowaway who believed himself a captain, stepped forward with a voice that cracked and said something about a god's will. The dragon turned his head slightly and exhaled, not flame but breath, and the priest's veil fluttered as if a jest had been made and the priest not been invited to hear the punch of it. A crack of heat ran down the slope, the island's own breath exhaling somewhere underfoot. Elia took another step. "If I ride you," she said, "I do not make myself your master. If you throw me and eat me, you make yourself a fool. There is little profit either way. But there may be a road we could walk that is one road, if you wish it." She did not know why she said wish to a creature whose body was a wish other men had made manifest and then lost. He eased his head lower. His jaw was a black gate. His tongue lay within, redder than a temple's embroidery. The old stories would have had a word here about consent, as if that were a ceremony men could hold up and admire. Elia did not take her eyes from his. They were not like a cat's or a snake's. They did not slit. They burned. She had never believed fire could have an attention. In the next breath, she believed it. Behind her someone moved, and that movement made a small, stupid sound. The dragon drew back. Elia's ribs hurt as if a hand had squeezed them. She turned. A young man with a short spear held as one holds a lie stood with cheeks as pink as meat in a market. He had a look in his eye that men did when they did not know whether to die for an idea or live for a coin. "Back," Mera said. The word cracked from a sheet of steel. He stepped back because men who have never disobeyed an order do not practice for when they should. The moment had broken. Elia did not rail at it. The world broke every moment into the next and expected you to so. She lowered her hand. "Tomorrow," she said, as if she were telling a lover a time and place. "If you are here, so am I." He wheeled that evening over the long grasses of the Dothraki Sea. He passed so low that a line of mares in a dry riverbed threw up their heads and danced in place, and men leaped upon their backs without bridles as if their bodies were the bridles they had been born to be. The Khal, whose people called him Father of Horses, when he was sober shook with laughter and fear both as the shadow covered him and his boy swung his short spear in a circle as if he could knit a roof against the sky. Ketsa did not move. She lay on her back and watched the razor belly pass and said to the old woman beside her, "He is hungrier than he knows." The old woman's laughter wheezed. "So was your husband," she said. "You fed him and he died. Perhaps feed this one better." "He does not eat what I can cook," Ketsa said, and the old woman patted her arm, pleased with a joke she had not Ade. When night came, Elia slept on the sloop because the men would have been less easy with a woman sleeping among their ash-caked rope, and she did not think it wise to make men uneasy when the ground itself could not be trusted. She dreamed of water turning to glass under heat, and of a boy 1,000 miles away holding a spear as if a story could be sharpened and thrown. She woke with ash in her mouth and the taste of coin on her tongue. In the dawn, she found Mara watching the dark ridge where the dragon had sat. "You will try again," Mara said. It was not a question. "Yes," Elia said. "You should not come close the second time. If I fall, you will want to fish me out. But if you fish me out, he may decide you are thieves." "I am a thief," Mara said. "I steal all day, time and safety, and the belief men have that they cannot be led." "You steal well," Elia said, and Mara's laugh was a bell rung once, low and close. Dennis was talking to himself as he oiled the leather of his satchel so Ash would not eat it. He had balanced his figures admirably and they looked handsome on the page, but they were lies in the sense that they told the truth about a thing too large for truth to be contained. He had written the line about the skull in King's Landing because he believed then that if he nailed two facts together with a bridge between them, the bridge would hold. Now, watching the island breathe and the men move as if the air had turned viscous, he thought of the skull and its empty eyes and wondered if absence had a measure. The dragon did not come down to them that day. He lifted and went seaward and returned and went again as if the world were a room and he were restless in it. Elia sat on the black sand with her legs folded under her and listened to her own heartbeat because it was a known thing. She watched him eat air as if it were food, and thought, "You are too big to be alone." And then, as if the thought had fallen out of her and called to itself, a thing like a cloud came off the sea. Men shouted. Men always shout. Dennis squinted and kept his mouth shut. Mara shaded her eyes with one palm and did not move otherwise. The thing broke into pieces, and the pieces were ships, and the ships were many, and their prows wore iron tongues like long bad ideas. The fleet came with an armada's certainty, an argument in planks and rope and belief. The Triarchs had decided that a problem could be solved by the kind of thinking that had made the problem. Elia rose. "He will turn," she said, though it was not certain. "He may not," Mara said, and she did not sound afraid or bold. She sounded like a woman who had seen storms fail and storms arrive. They had built for this long ago, men ignorant and ingenious both. The scorpion, ballista dressed for a bigger prey, with sinew wound until it sang, had held sway in the dance of dragons, if one believed old quills that had dipped in ink made of blood and pride both. These were newer, heavier, and they rode on low decks so they would not topple the ships that bore them. They came with crews who had practiced in the salt wind and learned to cheat it a little, and with gods hung on their necks and oaths bound to their wrists. The dragon turned. Elia's stomach dropped as if she had stepped off a cliff into an old story, and then steadied as the truth of change clarified in her. There are moments where what will be does not choose between two roads but makes a third by walking. He came down from his high circle and stroked once along the water. His wingtips licked spray and hissed. His shadow chopped itself on the waves and laid itself over a dozen decks, so the men who manned the scorpions felt night at noon and saw their gods hidden and did not falter. They cut their first volley too short, from caution or miscalculation, and iron harrows sank like bad bets into the water a ship length from their target. He rose and the next volley walked with him and found meat. 2 harpoons struck along his left side, close to the wing root. He shuddered, and the shudder went through the air as far as the sloop and made Elia's teeth hammer together. He did not cry out. He twisted. A 3rd harpoon took his flank and did not go in. It glanced, screeching like a saw along scale, and went spinning up and then down into the sea, where it broadened the shadow of a whale for a heartbeat before it sank into a deeper story. He rounded like weather. He opened his mouth, and the breath of him was not a line or a cone, but a thought that had not yet learned to be a line or a cone. The nearest ship became a lamp. Men crawled on it with a courage that would have been admirable if it had not been absurd. He passed over it and left behind a thing that had been shaped by good hands from green wood and stronger rope and will, now unmade into something that might as well have been drift or a maester's note about disaster. He took 3 ships in a breath and a 4th in the breath after. The crews began to work their drills for lines, not for scorpions. Men threw ropes into water, not at a dragon, and hauled men who were burning until the water scalded them into flesh again. The red priest who had come ashore fell to his knees and thanked his god for a god's victory over men who thought themselves gods. And Mara said to Elia out of the side of her mouth, "Strange to be grateful to a man because his god is winning." "Strange to be grateful to a dragon," Elia said, and did not add, "for being so large." He took another volley as he wheeled back, and this one had thought in it, a net cast high where his wing would cut. It struck and flared and caught half a beat before it burned. The men holding its ends felt the pull of the world on a lever longer than anything ever made, and were dragged forward into their own timbers and broke bones on wood. The dragon raked along the net like a knife along a lock of hair, and left half of it trailing from a spur of bee. One at his shoulder like a ragged feather. Dennis wrote later, notable oral phenomenon. The sound not of the flame but of the draft required to feed it. Not audible at a distance but causes notable change in inhalation of witnesses, as men forget to breathe when watching fire. He did not write what he thought as he watched flesh go to light and ash and salt water hammer cool against heat, because such thinking made him remember a boy who had once been afraid of lanterns because they fluttered when he walked past and made the world less sure. When the last ship turned tail and made its oars a ladder away from doom, the dragon came in low over the beach and found the stone and settled with a grunt. He had 4 new wounds that were not deep enough to kill him and not shallow enough to be nothing. Blood ran slow and thick from one hole where a harpoon had come near the place scale gives to ligament. Elia went with a bucket and a cloth because there was work and she was a woman who could do work. Mara took the bucket from her, because there was some work that a lady must do or be less than she believed herself to be. "Salt," Dennis said, absurd and correct. "Clean first, then wrap, if it can be wrapped, above the puncture." He spoke to be useful and to keep the part of himself that had been a boy close to the part of himself that was a man with habits. The dragon watched them. He did not flinch when Mara's clean cloth lay against his weeping scale. He did not move when Elia's hand traced the rag of netting and found it snagged in a ridge made from older hurt and newer healing. "Let me," she said, and he let her. The net came free with a soft, ugly sound. Elia threw it aside as one flings weeds off an oar. "You risked," she told him, which was not praise or reprimand but the naming of a thing that had happened. That night wind came down off the hills smelling of brim and metal. Ketz awoke under it and said, "It is like the breath of a horse when they have run far." The old woman turned over and muttered, "Sleep until the hoof falls." And then, in a different voice, that of a younger self speaking from behind the stones of years, "Or rise and see the hooves." Ketz arose. She had new work now. She had thought once her life would be a line drawn like a boy's spear in the air. Straight, foolish, brave. The line had turned, slowly, into a path, and the path into a trail she could smell. She followed it not with her feet but with a way her head had of cocking to listen. It led her west. She whistled to the horse she had stolen from a man who had stolen it and mounted without a saddle. When she rode away, her husband did not wake. He would not wake to the idea that a woman might choose her road. He would wake to the idea that his horse was gone. Mara slept on the sloop because she trusted the sea more than land, and Elia slept on the beach because she trusted herself and no one else. Dennis slept between rocks because he trusted nothing and thought the rocks might at least be indifferent to his presence. The dragon did not sleep. He dozed and woke in the sly way that forges do, and ash sifted upon him as if the sky wanted to dress him for something. In the morning Elia walked to him and did not reach to touch him until she had stood in the wind of him long enough to be sure it was not fear telling her what to do. She climbed, not as a lady mounts a horse, because there was no stirrup and no hand to hold, and because he would have bit her in half if she had presumed the habits of men upon him. She climbed as she had once climbed a mast to cut a line that had snarled the sail and threatened to make 4 men's day into their last. She set her feet where skin met skin and scale met scale and found purchase not in corners but in arcs. She slid along the ridge of his neck and came near the place where his thews ran under skin like a ship's cable. Dennis let himself breathe, once, when she sat there and did not die. Mara did not breathe. No one spoke. The dragon lifted his head and Elia's body followed because gravity is only one allegiance in a day. Now, she said. He pushed with his hindquarters and the ground fell away as a bad argument suddenly resolved by a knife. The air made a sound through Elia's teeth. Her hands went where hands had no right to be and found holds because the world sometimes forgives the bold for a breath. He made 1 bound, 2, and then the ash under them was a floor, and then it was nothing, and then it was air. Elia did not look down. She looked along the length of him because down and up were the same. Men had written the word flight in their books 1,000 times and had meant birds and had measured the angle of a wing against the angle of a fall. Elia learned it as a verb for which men had not made a tense. He was not smooth. He did not cut the air like a knife. He battered it into a shape and then lived in the shapes he made. He buelled wind into cave and made that cave his house for a heartbeat and left it for the next cave and the next. She laughed. She could not help it. The wind took her laugh and tore it and fed it under his wing and it buffeted him in turn, in a tiny way that drew his attention and made him twist and look back at her with one red eye. She had the absurd thought that he wanted to see if she was still there and if she could justify herself. Yes, she told him, for as long as I can be. The ground lay beneath them like a map. The western sea to left, softening into a blue that had too much salt in it to be sweet. The black ridges of ruin under them and then behind them, to the right, a wide yellow-brown that had been men's home for so long that even gods respected it. He did not take her far. He took her exactly as far as his curiosity would go and then turned her back with a bound that had the grace of an insult. He landed on another rock and crouched, expecting. She slid down off his neck with less grace than she would have liked and bent to rest her hands on her knees and then straightened because she would not show weakness to a living mountain. Men cheered because they needed to, and then turned away because they could not bear to look at both of them too long. Mara smiled as if she had just balanced a ledger to the last counting stick and found it pleasing. Dennis took up his pen and wrote only 1 line. First flight observed from ground and from back both, then blotted it out because the arrogance of that sentence offended him. That afternoon, the Iron Bank sent a man to the sloop. He wore a plain coat and plainer face and walked as if he were measuring the deck with his steps not for curiosity but for interest. He asked for Mara by name and used no titles. He addressed Elia as Madam and Dennis as Maester and did not let his eyes rest on the dragon where he lay, as if he had been instructed that a treasurer does not count what he cannot hold in his hand. He said, Bravos has an interest in the stability of the narrow sea. We have a further interest in spectacles that have historically hardened into regimes. The bank would be relieved if the Lady of Dragonstone would bring the creature under honorable contract. Honor and contracts are not ducks who lift together from a pond, Mara said. They rise when they please. Honorable is a word with variant spelling, the man said blandly. In Bravos we spell it binding. In Dragonstone we spell it earned, Mara said. You wish to bridle something you cannot look at. You ask the wrong house. He did not splay his hands, which would have been too expressive. If the lady will not take gold, the bank will find men who will. The bank has always found men. Mara smiled as if he had offered her a cramped room on a cold night. We are not men, she said. And the man's mouth tightened because he had never liked the way the world used plural sometimes as a weapon. Dennis watched the exchange with the loathing of a man who has made a life with words and learned how poorly they fit most mouths. He wanted to write all this down. The way the bank's messenger walked, the small pride of him, the way the world turned around him without his consent, and he resented that. He wanted to write the way Mara's gaze held and moved and held. He would write none of it. The records had no space for the parts of the world that mattered but could not be footnoted. They stayed 3 days. Elia rode the dragon at dawn and afternoon, no higher than a tower's height, no farther than a line of ships at anchor might be from a pier. Each time he sent her away when his curiosity grew full, as if he had tasted a new fruit and found it worth the trouble of peeling but not yet a meal. Each time she brought him food with her hands and her eyes. Mara organized men without turning it into a ceremony. Dennis watched a spear of new rock thrust up from a vent and made a note about the earth under dragons changing, as if even stone found it hard to do as it always had. On the 4th day, men with blue hands and blue tongues and blue faith came in a convoy of thin boats with high prows. Qohor had sent them, though Dennis did not know whether to be impressed at the speed of the city's news or dismayed at the speed of its fear. They brought with them a crate built for a thing with too many hinges, and the thing inside it shivered as if it had nerves. They called it Dragon's Bane in their soft talk, and then in their hard talk called it what it was. A poison that had lived in stories more than in men's blood. The men saw themselves as heroes. Men who bring poison always do. Elia met them on the beach with ash making her hair honest again. She smiled. She had the kind of smile that made men wonder whether she could be bought, and if so, for what. "You have come far to save us," she said. "To save you from yourselves," said the man who had the right to speak. He had ink spiraling up his arms and eyes that had never laughed. "To save you from a beast that knows only hunger. To save your children from eating ashes and your grandchildren from living under the shadow of a thing that will wait for them in the sky." "You do not know my children," Elia said. "You do not know your grandchildren." She stepped aside. "If you wish to save me, go save a man willing to be saved." He stared past her at the dragon and licked his lips. The whisper ran along the boats in a language Elia did not speak fluently. The ritual language of men who need rituals to keep themselves from seeing. The men hefted their crate. Dennis moved before he had decided to. He put himself between the crate and the dragon because he had counted the ways a world could be measured and decided most were lies except the way it measured you when you stood and did not move. "You would kill what you fear," he said, and heard how weak the sentence was. "You do not know." "We know," the man said. "We have known longer than your line has breathed. This has happened before. We know what follows dragons. Burnt cities and banners that mean nothing and men with silver hair who believe the world owes them. We will kill the beast and then we will kill the story that grew in his shade. And then perhaps the world will grow quiet again." "The world has never been quiet," Dennis said, and smiled dismally because he was arguing with men whose gods had no sense of humor. Mara came with 10 of her sailors walking like a thought someone did not want to finish. "No," she said. She did not raise her voice. It cut as if it had a fine edge. "You will not do this thing on my beach." "It is not your beach," the blue man said. But he stepped back because men learn in the bone what the tongue refuses to admit. "You will carry your crate back to your thin boats," Mara said. "You will tell your city that Dragonstone regards blue hands on black shores as an insult we will answer in our own time. If your city has questions, I will answer them at the tip of an oar or the point of a quill, as they prefer. Leave, or stay and die for your crate." He weighed it, and the crate weighed nothing against the cost of dying and everything against the cost of living a coward. He gestured, and his men picked up the crate and the boats nosed back into the whispering water. When they had gone, Mara said to Dennis, "You were brave in a maester's way. Do not practice it too often. It requires a body that writes less than it bleeds." Elia knelt beside the dragon's foreleg. "They will come again," she said. "The dragons I slit narrowed not for light but for attention. They will come with gold in their mouths and greatness in their hands," Mara said. "We will answer with a ship's ballast and a ledger, and a dragon." "Dragons do not belong to anyone," Dennis said, and the dragon turned his head slightly, as if a man had finally said a line that the day could carry. On the 5th morning they left the island. The dragon came with them not because they asked but because he woke and thought to move the way a man wakes and thinks to drink. He rose and followed and passed them and waited and followed again like a cat that has decided it trusts you today. Elia rode him as one rides a mood, with no illusions about mastery and a willingness to fall. They made Westeros in 3 days because the wind had their work in it and because the sea was kind in the way that has nothing to do with pity and everything to do with physics. Dragonstone rose from the water like a story a man tells himself when he hates the world and wants to live in it anyway. The castle was a beast put to sleep and fossilized where it lay. The dragon circled it once and again and then settled on the outer yard like a thing claiming ancestral right. Men ran because men always run before they decide whether to run toward or away. Bells rang as if the island were listing. Mara stood in the yard and folded her arms and said, "Welcome home." And if the island heard her, it did not say. They brought the skull up from the vault because sometimes men need a smaller god to measure the larger one against. The men who hauled ropes to drag the skull across stone breathed in short, high puffs, as if they were afraid that if they took a full breath something would take it from them. The skull came like a remnant of summer, an old heat, a memory of shape. Its teeth were thick as the thigh of a strong man. Its eye sockets could have housed a pair of barrels. Men who had never left the island looked at it and found their eyes watering because dust had memories baked into it. The dragon came to the yard because he had been there before the yard had been carved and had no need of its invitation. He lowered his head as if considering whether to make a mess. He put his snout against the skull and it made a hollow sound, would drum on stone. He blew, gently, and dust flew out and eddied in sunlight. He opened his mouth and made a sound that was not flame and was not hunger. It was something lost and found and lost again. Dennis was there with his pen and did not write. Elia stood with her hand on his foreleg and did not speak. Mara watched the men in the yard and chose their sentences before they chose them for themselves. One said, "Hushed, Balerion," because men love old names. Another said, "Bigger," because a lie told in a yard with a dragon in it becomes truth. A third whispered the name of a king or a queen depending on which part of the yard he stood in, and Mara marked him with her eyes as problematic. "Bring it back to the vault," she said, and the men were glad to move the skull, and they did not ask whether she meant the dragon or the bone. The dragon watched as they hauled, and Elia watched him watch, and Dennis measured a thing no one could weigh, a world in which dragons set the terms of metaphor and measurement both. He went to his chamber and set his pen in its stand and did not take it up for an hour, and when he did he wrote one sentence and then stopped, appalled. He had written, "He is larger than we in the only way that matters." He blotted it to illegibility. The raven from Old Town came on a gray morning that had rain and salt mixing in a way that made the island smell like the underside of a dock. Preston's seal was on it. Dennis broke it with hands that had not felt clumsy in years. The letter said little and much. Reports of the skull missing in King's Landing because the thing that had held it had fallen. Reports of men making kings out of necessity and unmaking them out of boredom. Reports of a boy with a face like a last summer island dusk holding a spear and believing it meant something. "Bring me a number," Preston had scrawled under all that. Dennis smiled and did not hate him for it. The old man played his part. Dennis would play his. They had 10 days of rain and one of sun, and then the sun grew bored with them and went east to see other things. In that time Elia flew each morning and each evening, and each time a handful more people on Dragonstone stood on the walls and watched and counted their teeth in their mouths and were glad of the number. In that time the Iron Bank sent another man with fewer words and a face like coins stacked. He left with an agreement that satisfied no one and therefore was the kind of agreement people keep. In that time, rumors rode the sea like seals, popping up and diving. A new head in the north that had old thoughts, a lord in the Reach who had married his sister because he did not trust anyone else's blood. A fleet in the Stepstones that had learned how to tilt harpoons to catch a wing mid-beat and to make a wound something more than pain. "Let them come," Mara said, with the impatient bravery of a woman whose hand knows where the knife is hung. "We will learn and will not be slow to learn. If they lay chains on us, we will eat them." Dennis did not argue. He wrote, "It seems certain now that the old limit is broken and the breaking sets a new set of questions." He did not send this to Old Town. He sent instead a list of clean measurements, all of which were partial, all of which told a story that was neat and therefore false. He told the truth to himself and feared himself a little for it. Ketsa made the narrow sea by ways men with charts do not trust. She arrived at Dragonstone with salt in her hair and a horse under her who did not like boats but had decided not to die on one as an act of goodwill. She walked up the old black road to the gate and told the guards in a Westerosi that surprised them that she had come to see the Beau Zirin of the sky. They laughed until she called them soft in her own tongue, and then they laughed again because a woman who spoke insults to guards deserved a place in their stories. They took her to Mara, who took her measure and liked it. "You have come far," Mara said, as if it were not a remark but a request to tell the bill it should present. "The road was there," Ketsa said. "I walked it. Also, men on horses are slow when they tell their stories. I became bored." "You will not be bored here," Mara said. "I am already bored," Ketsa said, and then, because the island had manners that seeped into even the fiercest, she added, "Lady, you come for the dragon." "I come because he passed over my tent in the night and did not burn it," Ketsa said. "I do not like to be overlooked." This pleased Mara so much she laughed aloud. "We will not overlook you. I will not promise what he will do." Ketsa found Elia that evening where the Lady of Dragonstone stood with her hips against a wall, as if she were flirting with the castle. "You will teach me," Ketsa said. "I will teach you how not to die," Elia said. "After that, everything is a personal style." "Good," Ketsa said. "Men have been teaching me to die since I was 6. I am bored of lessons." They flew together at dawn 3 days later, because the dragon had decided that 2 women on his neck were less ridiculous than 1, and because Elia had decided the thing that would kill them was not weight but arrogance, and she did not carry that. Ketsa found holds where no one else would have thought to find them, because she had learned to hold to anything that would hold her. She laughed into the wind with a sound like a war song shortened to a chorus. Dennis watched them and thought briefly of a girl whose hair had been as black as rope, and who had once laughed when he fell in a pond and had helped him out and had later married a man with a waist and a name that opened doors and lived a boredom that killed her slower than water can. He shook his head and pulled his hood up against a rain that had not started. They came out of the stepstones as if they had already won and needed only to come and be paid for it. They had 10 scorpions on 10 low decks and a captain who did not say he had a god in his pocket because he did not believe in pockets. They came at night, when he thought the dragon would be a darker darkness and easier to miss. He was right about the darkness and wrong about the ease. They sent boats ahead with divers holding ropes in their teeth. The divers set anchors in the shallow bottom of the small cove where Mara had taught boys to read a line of tide across water. And the ropes were long and had hooks, and the hooks were barbed. The barbs would not break when drag came. Men had thought about that and had thought well. They threw the ropes at dawn when the dragon had gone to the yard to warm his belly in the small sunlight that had made it through clouds. The hooks bit at the edges of his wings like sudden teeth, and the ropes went taut and hummed. He rose and the ropes sang and held. He pulled and the anchors crept and lodged deeper. Men who have never heard their own plan work in the world the way a word works in a mouth cried aloud because victory makes the voice a stranger. Elia was on the ground. Mara had sent Ketsa with the boy who had spilled sand in the scriptorium to bring up more food than the dragon needed because it had pleased her to make the boy carry weight. Dennis came out of the gatehouse with ink on his thumb and the look of a man who has been reminded he has a body. The ropes cut the air with a music that had no kindness in it. The dragon roared, and the roar had pain tucked in it like a stone in bread. Elia ran. Mara shouted to men to cut ropes and did not ask whether they could swim. Dennis grabbed a knife without thinking of the pen he had set down and touched its edge and did not care that it was dull. The ropes had been braided from 3 ropes. The hooks had teeth that would not let go if a woman begged them. The scorpions fired and the bolts came heavy as bad omens and fast as bad news. One struck the wing web and went through and hit stone and shivered. Another struck the arc where wing met shoulder and stuck and stayed. Men hauled on their lines and shouted. The dragon leapt because leaping is what dragons do when the world proposes bondage. He went up, hauling boats, because there is nothing in anything that says a dragon may not haul a boat if it pleases him or if it is necessary. The boats came with him a body's length and then fell back with the noise a rope makes when it remembers its limits. Men went into water. Men died because rope took them and would not let go. The dragon's wing tore where a bolt had made a weakness, and tearing sounded like canvas on a gale's day. Elia got under the nearest rope with her knife and cut not the thick but the thin, because she had cut nets before and knew that the large thing makes you foolish. She cut the small that unspun the larger. The rope shuddered. Ketsa appeared under another line with a boy's knife in her teeth and took it between hands and made it into something she could chew. Mara found a hatchet where a man had left it and swung it and thought of the way a ledger balances only when enough has been cut away from one column and added to another. Dennis saw the diver rise like a seal and take a breath and dive again and knew he dove for the anchor to settle it deeper, and Dennis did a brave thing he could not explain later. He ran and threw himself into the water and found, by a luck he would have called fate if he believed in such things, the very rope that diver meant to touch. He wrapped his arms and legs around it and became weight on a line that had too much weight already. The diver came and saw a man on his rope and tried to shake him. Dennis held because he had held on to less for longer. He got a mouthful of salt and thought briefly of a bowl of apples. Elia cut the last small rope that held the larger side and let go. The dragon tore the last hooks out of his wing with a sound like a city wall settling after a tremor. He climbed. The boats spun out their lines like the beginning of a story and the end of another and went over. Men drowned because ropes tied to their waists remembered their lesson better than they did. The scorpions fired into empty air, and men stood, suddenly useless, with the thing that had made them brave in their hands. He rose and turned and came down. He did not breathe fire on the boats because the boats had been brave in a way that demanded another answer. He took the scorpions first. He took them with his claws, not because it was the best way but because it was the right way. He raked the decks where the iron sat and destroyed the iron with a stubbornness that was almost human. Then he breathed, because a dragon must be a dragon. And the last of the men who had believed themselves to be clever enough to tie mountains to the earth learned a different lesson. After, when the smoke went sideways and the wind came down the cove as if it had found its manners again, the dragon lay down. He lay the way men lie when something in them has been torn and fixed badly. Elia went to him and put her hand where his wing had gone from whole to knot. "You chose," she said softly. "You chose the right thing and the hard thing." He did not look at her. He looked at the sea. Dragons remember water differently than men do. He blinked once, and the inner lid came and went like a curtain in a small theater. They nursed him through that because there was nothing else to do, and because work steadies the hand and the heart. Dennis found that he could stitch a wingcloth better than he could stitch a man and did not choose to think about what that said about him. Ketsa sang to herself in a language no one else on the island knew and learned, by chance, that the dragon liked that. He did not like the songs of the seven, which bored him. He did not like the chants of the red priests, which annoyed him. He liked Ketsa's songs because they made the air into a field again and gave him back the night where he had first chosen not to burn a tent. When the wing mended and he flew again without the twitch a scar sometimes leaves, Mara said the sentence she had been making in herself for months. "We will not take a throne. We will make a pact. We will name it and swear to it and keep it by the old manners of sea and stone." Elia raised an eyebrow because she had never loved pacts. "Name it," she said. "The Pact of Wings," Mara said, and the men in the room made the soft sound men make when they are relieved by words they understand. "Dragonstone will not claim dominion while the dragon lies here. We will not burn men to make them obey. We will fly to put out fires that have been lit to call us. We will show the world the shape of what could burn a city and then not do it." "They will test you," Dennis said. He did not say they, he said the world, because the world deserves its name. "They will," Mara said, "and we will answer." They answered in the stepstones again when a petty king without a crown began to take coin for safe passage and then took men as well, because coin once grows boring. They answered in the Blackwater when a warlord set boats full of oil on fire and sent them into trade because he had learned only the first thing about fire. They answered in the Reach when fields went dry and a small village set out buckets to catch dew and thieves came at night and took dew with hands that had done worse. Not every answer was flame. The dragon landed in fields and breathed, not fire, but heat, and fog lifted and dew fell, and the men who had come to steal dew looked at themselves and went away. Elia grew slower to laugh and quicker to smile as she learned the weight of each day. Ketsa learned to write her name in the Westerosi hand and then wrote it on a boy's arm because he asked and then laughed at him because he thought it a binding. Dennis wrote to Old Town and to Paristan most of all, and to himself in a book he hid in a wall. He wrote, "There is a number beyond numbers." He wrote, "If Balerion's skull is a hall, then Drogon alive is the mountain that throws shade over it, and what is a skull's measure against the weather that moves in a sky?" A rumor rose and cloaked itself in men's breaths before it found a voice. The rumor said that a king had been crowned in the north who had no interest in crowns. The rumor said men in the Westerlands had begun to bind their women again, because no one had burned their house down yet for it. The rumor said the Iron Bank had found a boy in Lys with a drop of blood old enough to buy men's mistakes. Elia listened and did not care. Mara listened and cared and sent ravens. Dennis listened and measured the rumor against the sound of the dragon's breathing and found it wanting. In Old Town, a boy whose hands were still scarred from rope and whose mouth had learned to say yes when a mistress lifted an eyebrow sat before Paristan with a sheet of paper and a pen that had been used by better men. Paristan asked, without looking up from the note he was writing, "Do you wish to take the silver link?" "Yes," the boy said. He had not known he wanted anything until he was told he could, and then he knew it. The chain would sit heavy on his neck and make him walk straighter because to bend would insult the men who had given it to him. "Then bring me a number," Paristan said, and the boy nodded and left and prayed to no one and everyone that numbers would come when called. They came at last to a day that stood like a hill with sky on one side and a drop on the other. The Iron Bank had chosen their men well this time. They came with a fleet that did not show itself until it had to, and with scorpions that did not need 10 men to fire them, and with lines that did not sing until it was too late to answer them with a hatchet. They came with a wind that had shifted at their back, and with a contract signed in a hand that had never trembled. They came with Summer Isles archers aboard who had decided to sell their skill for a price that would buy their island, and with an understanding that dragons are less vulnerable to wit than to exhaustion. Mara watched them from the high tower and did not say anything at all. Elia flew at dawn with Ketsa behind her and saw the glimmer on the water that meant men had polished metal for war and thought, "Not today." She turned and came back and found Mara with her hands flat on the table in the great hall like a woman about to push herself up from a meal and leave others to the washing. Dennis had ink on his cuffs and did not apologize. "Now," Mara said, and Elia nodded. They flew. The sea woke with them and rose to sea. The first volley came not at them but at the air in front of them, a blade of iron meant to make the air rip and take the wing with it. It did not, because the dragon had learned the sound of a scorpion being cranked and the taste of iron in the wind, and he slipped as a boy ducks a thrown stone. The second volley came low and toward the belly. Elia pressed her legs and leaned them hard, and they climbed, and the bolts made a fence where their bodies had been. The Summer Isles archers had a better idea. They had always had better ideas where men thought iron enough. They sent a rain of small fire, not to burn but to distract, and a flock of sparrows might have made as much difference, except that these fell with intelligence. And when a man plans a thing with intelligence long enough, it learns some. The dragon twisted and shook 100 small pains out of his hide the way a horse shakes flies off. Ketsa slapped at one spark on Elia's sleeve and left a black kiss there. They went for the flagship because men love thrones, even at sea. The flagship had 2 ballistae built like shrines. The first bolt whispered past Elia's ear and took a sliver of hair with it and made her grin involuntarily at the neat violence of the world. The second would have taken her mouth and the back of her head with it if the dragon had not rolled. He had learned to roll in a way that broke the air, and with it the aim of men who had thought the air their friend. He took the bolt in his shoulder where old scar sat, and old hardness did work new bone could not. He landed on the stern and crushed carved dolphins and men both, because he did not care for art that pretended never to have known blood. He breathed and the deck glowed and sank and hissed like a man's temper meeting reason. They did not destroy them all. This was Mara's plan and Elia's agreement, and the dragon's preference, which made it a plan the world could bear. They broke enough to make the Iron Bank write a new contract. They left enough men alive to tell the story the way it had happened, which is the only story that keeps wars from reproducing themselves like vermin. The last of the ships lay low in the water and limped away with their oars biting the sea like repentance. After Men brought Ketsa wine because she had plucked a bolt from the dragon's flank with her teeth when her hands had been otherwise occupied. And men love stories that let them be brave by telling them. She drank, and then went to sleep on the black stones under the wall with her arm thrown over her face like a woman who had never seen a fire, never seen a rope, never seen a boy going toward a mistake and decided to let him, just this once. Dennis wrote to Peristan, "The number you asked for cannot be given by a hand, only by a horizon." He sealed it and sent it, and then took out the book in the wall and wrote for himself, "Bigger than Balerion in the way that matters." He wrote, "We have made a choice that dragons once made for us. Not to take." He wrote, "I fear the Citadel will call restraint weakness and send a knife with a note tied to it." He did not sign that last, because a man should not put his name on a fear if he cannot defend it. In the cool of a morning when mist sat like a shawl on the sea, Elia took the dragon east alone. Ketsa slept. Mara read. Dennis dreamed, eyes open. They flew above the smoke that rose always over the old wound. He bent his head to it and drank. Not smoke, but the heat under it. Men had written about dragons drinking fire, and Dennis had put a line through it in his mind. Now he untied the knot he had made there. He drank and grew stronger, because that is how a thing made of need and memory does. They flew beyond Valyria because there is always a beyond. They saw a city cut into white cliff that men said had never had a name because the people there did not believe names could keep anything from happening. They saw a caravan on a strand of sand that lay like a belt on the world, and a woman walking beside a camel with her hand flat on its side so it could count with her. They saw a boy on a raft who had decided to push himself into the wider water rather than stay on the safe kind. And Elia shouted down to him, and the wind took her words and made them into something he heard and saluted. When they came back to Dragonstone, the sky had the look it gets when evening has decided to be early. Dennis met them in the yard with a face that had something of a father in it and something of a man who has put a thing down and forgotten where. "Peristan is dead," he said. He said it the way a man says a day is over. He fell asleep in his chair and did not wake. He was writing when he went. He had written a number, and the number was wrong. "Good," Elia said, because she had no love for men's correctness, and because a sage dying in his chair seemed to her a gift from a generous god. Dennis nodded. "He wrote to me before that," he said. "He wrote that numbers and kings are the same. They are arguments men use to make themselves feel less small. He wrote that Balerion was as large as a story needed and Drogon is as large as a world allows." He smiled, wry and tired. "He wrote that I must come home and put a link on a boy." "You will go," Mara said. It was not a question. "I will," Dennis said. "I will come back if the sea allows me." He bowed his head to the dragon without thinking of whether it was ridiculous, and the dragon watched him and blinked and moved his head very slightly, as if to say that a man who had wrapped himself around a rope once was always welcome. On the night before Dennis sailed, they climbed to the highest black tower where wind has a room and the sea has a voice men cannot tell secrets to. Elia stood with her hands on the parapet and felt the stone under them like a sentence whose verb had been put off for a better day. Ketsa lay on her back and counted stars with a mouth that tasted of salt and a mind that counted in a different base than anyone around her. Mara came last, because she always let others go ahead and see if the road held. "People will say we were offered a crown and put it down," Mara said. "People will say you took it and hid it," Ketsa said. "People will say we were afraid," Elia said. "We were," Mara said. "That is the only sensible way to meet a thing like this. But we were afraid of the right thing. We feared ourselves." The dragon sat on the court below because there was no room for him on the tower, and because the tower had been built by men who had thought they would never need to house a mountain. He slept with the sleep of a forge that has cooled but not died, and the smoke from his nostrils rose and was taken and rose again. His wing, scar mended long months ago, twitched once as if it remembered the water pulling at it and resented history. They stood a long time. The wind told jokes that men had forgotten the setup to, and the sea laughed and forgot why. Elia said, finally, "Balerion was the Black Dread because men named him. Drogon is dread without name." She smiled. "But he chose with us. That matters." "It matters more than anything," Dennis said. In Old Town they will say, I let the world happen to me and called it learning. They will award me a link for knowledge I did not make. They will make me tell them where to put their numbers. I will tell them to keep them in a drawer. I will tell them a dragon's size is not in his bones but in the shade he chooses to cast. Ketsa rolled onto her side and propped her head on her hand and looked at him as if he were a man she might once have married if he had been born in the right tent and learned to ride the right horse. You talk well, she said. You should sing. I have no ear, Dennis said. You have two, Ketsa said. They are small. It is enough. They laughed. The night took their sound and laid it on the water, and the water carried it and handed it to the morning, which raised an eyebrow and continued with its business. Dennis sailed the next day and did not die on the way, which made him exceptional and ordinary both. He went home and put the silver link on a boy who shook while he did it. He told the boy a story about a rope and a sea and a man who had been a coward until the moment he was not. The boy cried in private and told no one and learned to read the wind from ink. The world did not end. This was the strangest thing. Men had expected an ending. They had thought giant creatures brought doorways, not roads. Instead they found themselves on a road with a dragon walking sometimes ahead where they could not see him, and sometimes beside them where they felt the heat of him, and sometimes behind where they heard him and did not turn around because they were frightened and because it was polite. Elia grew older and did not grow tired. Ketsa married a man with hands like rope and left him when he tried to tell her the shape of her day, and married another who only asked sometimes and she said yes when she meant it. Mara died with her boots on and her mouth open with orders, and the men on the island kept listening for her voice for so long that their children learned to listen too, and no one ever told them why they were cocking their heads. Dennis wrote until his hand one day did not lift, and the boy who had been given a link put a blanket over him and wept in a way that made his breath hitch as if a rope had been pulled through him. The dragon grew. He did not grow as a child grows, in leaps that surprise you and then plateaus that make you think perhaps you have leveled at last. He grew as a landform grows, incrementally and without apology. One day men noticed that the shade he cast covered the yard entire when he lay there. Then, some years after, they noticed that the shade reached to the wall. Then the shade fell over the water, and men in boats found themselves in night at noon and looked up and remembered that their gods were old and very far away. The skull in the vault became a toy, as old men tell young men about war as if it were a thing that could be told. So young men told their sons that the skull had once frightened them. Elia took a child down on a day when the child had asked the word why too many times in a row for adults to tolerate, and the child put a hand in the skull's eye hole and shouted because the echo made his voice sound larger than his body. Elia put her palm to the bone and thought, we do not grow by being bigger than men were. We grow by being better. The world argued with that. It always will. In Volantis, men who had lost coin when their galleys burned hired knives who had lost fathers to dragons in old stories and told them the coin would not be clean. The knives took it and cleaned it with their mouths. They traveled west and learned the island's tides the hard way, and when they struck in a kitchen where Elia happened to be because she had been hungry. She killed two with a ladle and one with a knife she had used to cut root vegetables. The fourth ran and she let him because fear keeps stories tidy. In Bravos, a new banker with a head like a coin and a smile like another coin gave up trying to hire a dragon and began to hire stories about the dragon. The stories paid better and killed no one the bank had a line on. In Old Town, the boy became a man and told other boys to bring him numbers, and they did. And then he taught them that numbers and truth are not bedfellows except on lucky nights. As for the North, it kept its own counsel because it is that kind of place. When Elia flew over its edge one winter to keep a promise she had once made to herself, the dragon's breath turned long white in the air and made a bridge that men below looked up at and stepped onto in their minds. A man whose head bore no crown and who had no interest in wearing one looked up at her and lifted a hand and did not wave. She nodded because she had never been taught to curtsy to a man without a house, and he had never been taught to bow to a woman with a mountain at her back. They grew the pact of wings into something more annoying and more durable than a law. They made it a habit. When men set fire to a granary, the dragon came and snuffed it. When men declared themselves kings of places that had never recognized kings, the dragon lay on a hillside near, and the man came out and shouted into the face of something that did not care about human throat. When men beat women in back rooms and dragged them by the hair into the street and called it custom, The dragon stood in the street and looked at them until they discovered a new custom. It did not work everywhere. Nothing does. It worked often enough that men began to put their knuckles down before the dragon arrived. In old age, which comes to everyone who is luckier than they deserve, Elia sat on a chair on a tower that had watched her climb when she was young and said to Ketsa, "We wanted a number." Ketsa, whose hair had gone the color of winter grass, said, "We got a road." Elia laughed. "We got a sky we could live under." "Better," Ketsa said, and spared Elia the trap of agreeing. They watched him sleep. He had always been most beautiful at rest, when the plates of his body told the story of forces and will rather than movement. His breath moved the ash that still fell on the island, sometimes on days when the East remembered. The sound of it was the sound of a world not done yet. Balerion, Elia said, was a story men used to make the world obey. Drogon is the part of the world that refuses. Dragons are horses if you do not own one, Ketsa said. Men look at them and say, if only. Then they get one and find they need to learn and are angry learning hurts. You have always been good at telling men what they do, Elia said. It pays, Ketsa said. Sometimes in coin. Sometimes in peace, Elia said. Dennis's book turned brittle and his ink brown to near invisibility. And a boy neither of them had known found it in the wall and read the lines that only a man with patience and bad light can read. Bigger than Balerion. He frowned and looked out the window at a yard where the dragon's shade lay over boys dueling with sticks and girls climbing each other like trees and men sleeping on their arms after work. He smiled and wrote in the margin, bigger where it matters, and then was ashamed and crossed it out and then was prouder than he had a right to be and left it so lightly that some other boy might see it later or not. The dragon outlived them all, as beasts with fire in their bellies do when men do not insist on killing them. He grew and grew tired less often than he had when he was young, and then more often because even mountains erode. He lay sometimes in the yard and men stepped around him as if he were a cart left out by mistake, and sometimes on the cliff and fishermen cursed him because he frightened fish and sometimes blessed him because he brought wind, and sometimes in the sea on his belly as if it had learned to be a road for him and he had accepted it. He slept in caves men could not enter without forfeiting the right to breathe. He woke when storms did and rode them like an old friend on a well-broken horse. If there is an end to such a story, it is a quiet one, because only men like fanfare for endings. One morning the yard was lit with a light that had come further than most. Elia was not there to see it. Ketsa was not there. Dennis was dust in the brains of a sparrow. Mara's bones lay under stone with no words above them because she had ordered there be none. The boy who had become a man who had made other boys into men stood with a pen in his hand and looked up because a shadow fell on his paper. He saw the dragon lift on wings that had grown and never found the top of growth. And he saw him turn east, once more, as if the day were a page only the dawn could write. He watched until his neck hurt. He watched until the black shape was a thought and then a memory and then a ghost someone else might not believe in. He put down his pen and went back to work because the day requires it. He did not write that the dragon had gone back to Valyria, because that would have been a lie told in certainty. He did not write that the dragon had gone to die, because that would have been an insult to the manner of living they had made. He wrote nothing, and this once nothing was the right size. But later, years after, a fisherman on the smoking sea told a boy pouring his beer that he had seen a night go dark at noon and a wing that might as well have been a continent pass above him, and that the breath of it had smelled of ash and iron and old decision. The boy said, as boys will, Balerion, and the fisherman shook his head and said, Balerion was a skull in a room. This was a mountain that moved. And the boy thought of living mountains, and of roads, and of the way a shadow can be a roof and a warning both, and he made no prayer at all and felt inexplicably blessed.